And we start with a little bit of an Africa Day trivia. Can you tell who said the following words? I am the grandchild of the warrior men and women that Hintsa and Sikukune led, the patriots that Cetshwayo and Pepu took to battle, the soldiers Mushweshwe and Gungunyane taught never to dishonor the cause of freedom. My mind and my knowledge of myself is formed by the victories that are the jewels in our African crown, the victories we earn from Isandlwana to Khartoum as Ethiopians and as the Ashanti of Ghana and the Berbers of the desert. I am an African. If you said Thabo Mbeki, you are correct, because Ziyanda Ngcobo is standing by to speak to the former president. Hello, Ziyanda.
Good afternoon, Dudu. Well, what can I say after such a remarkable introduction for someone who embodies the values and the African Renaissance? And we've just concluded a media briefing here in Guinea-Conakry. Of course, we've joined as Newzroom Africa the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, that has endeavored to have its first annual Mbeki lecture, the 13th edition, here in the West African country of Guinea. And of course, it's the country that has birthed the likes of Amaka Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, and our very own Miriam Makeba, who spent 10 years here in exile. And at that briefing earlier, of course, which was basically buttressing and setting us up for Saturday's annual lecture, which will be taking place in the evening, and we'll be bringing all those proceedings to our audiences. One of the key things that came out was that whilst the continent still faces challenges, there is still a lot of hope. And former President Mbeki, welcome to Newzroom Africa on Channel 405. And one of the key things that you just focused on now was that the policies of the AAU, which was formerly the Organization of African Union, are good. But just like many African countries, implementation remains an issue. Now, there's been much criticism, for an example, when you look at the conflict that's currently taking place in Russia and Ukraine. I was watching the news this morning, and Ukraine is saying the policy of non-alignment cannot stand in the current situation. African countries must take a stand. Are we in a position to even do that?
Well, thanks a lot. I must first of all say a happy Africa Day.
Happy Africa Day to you too.
Happy Africa Day to everybody. Newzroom Africa listeners and viewers and everybody else. Yes, indeed. No, the African response to this conflict that is going on between Russia and Ukraine, I must say it's typically African. We see it happening every day on the continent. When conflict breaks out in Africa, all of us will say, stop the shooting, to create the conditions for discussions to end the war. So we can't start. You look at any issue on the continent. The continent will never intervene in any issue by starting to condemn one country or the other. It's because you need to resolve the conflict. You don't start resolving the conflict by taking sides. You resolve the conflict by saying, let us sit and discuss this issue. It's in the course of the discussion, of the negotiation, that it becomes possible to say you are wrong, you are right. But that's not a starting point. So whatever demand is made of the African continent, that from the beginning the continent must take sides, is going to fail. The continent won't do that. I'm saying precisely to be able to prepare conditions for negotiations and for the continent to be an honest broker.
So then do you agree then with the 6 countries that are going to now be sending envoys to both Russia and Ukraine as a part of the peace efforts?
So I think it's important that the African continent has intervened at that level. I think it's important because that conflict, apart from anything else, has affected the continent very directly. Because a lot of the wheat that we get on the continent comes from there. A lot of the fertilizer that we get comes from there. And when there's a conflict, it interrupts those two. So even at the last AU summit, the matter of the fertilizer was raised. Because there are many countries on the continent that have not been able to use fertilizer because of the conflict. And that produces food insecurity. So I'm saying it's important that the African continent intervenes at that senior level and hopefully succeed.
But part of the criticism, former President, has been that you're sending an envoy and heads of states to Russia and Ukraine, and yet right here on the African continent, we still have an ongoing conflict in Sudan, which is entering, I think, its 6th week now. You've got the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia. The DRC is one of those 6 countries that is sending a head of state, and yet in the Great Lakes region, they are struggling with the M23 rebels, and the East African community itself has struggled to actually bring about peace in that area. Is it not contradictory? And what message is that sending to Africans?
No, it's not. It's not contradictory. It's with regard to Sudan, there's a similar heads of state intervention on Sudan at the level of the Peace and Security Council, which will meet in 2 days' time at summit level. So that's not 15 countries of the continent at summit level must meet and say what we do about the Sudan matter. So simultaneously, as you will have some Africans traveling to Europe regarding Russia and Ukraine, you have these Africans convening in Africa to deal with Sudan at the head of state level. So the conflict in Ethiopia between the central government and Tigray, fortunately, has stopped. But it has not. There are other violent conflicts that are taking place in Ethiopia, particularly in Oromia. So this is a matter that is really work in progress to try and resolve these matters as a whole. And in the Ethiopian case, it's necessary to follow what was agreed in Pretoria, to have this political discussion between the government of Ethiopia and the TPLF of Tigray, which must lead to a national conference, so that all of the Ethiopians together come together to define what kind of Ethiopia do we want. But that's all work in progress. Nothing is being ignored.
You've also just lamented now in this briefing, again, it's about implementation and having an African court of justice. You'll know that back home there's a consistent discussion about the International Criminal Court, whether or not South Africa should withdraw after it voluntarily signed the Rome Statute. There is that warrant of arrest issued against Russian President Vladimir Putin. Your assessment of what needs to happen here, can we actually afford and do we have the capacity to even arrest Putin?
Well, I doubt it. I don't think the South African government would engage in an action like that against any head of state. I doubt it very much. How they would deal with this matter, I'm not sure. What I've heard is that the Deputy President of the Republic, Paul Mashatile, is leading a group to find an answer to the question what is to be done. But I doubt if they would arrest the President of Russia or anywhere for that matter. There is indeed a challenge in that it's necessary for the African continent to do what it has decided to do, which is to establish an African Court of Justice, which deals with all of these matters that are in the Rome Statute, like genocide, crimes against humanity, things like that. We need an African court to do that, so that the matters are tried on the continent by our own courts. The problem is that the protocol that was negotiated and concluded some years back, various African countries are reluctant to ratify. I think it's because many of them think the protocol infringes too much on domestic sovereignty.
Yes.
But if they don't have that protocol, they don't ratify it, then the International Criminal Court becomes the court of first resort. So this complaint we have as Africans, why is the International Criminal Court arresting so many of our people, Africans? It will continue. The reason it's doing that is because we have no capacity, continental-wise, to try those particular cases, unless we establish this court. So it's necessary to persuade the African countries. If you're complaining about the ICC, establish African Court of Justice.
So then should South Africa withdraw from the ICC? You're talking about these complaints. That would still be a process. But in the meantime, the BRICS summit in August is around the corner. What should South Africa do?
Well, they must continue. South Africa is chairing BRICS this year. So it must continue to discharge its responsibilities with regard to chairing of BRICS. Whether it's going to be possible to host a BRICS summit in South Africa, I'm not sure about that. The other BRICS works will continue without no problems. But this one particular instance, because I think it would be, I don't think South Africa would not have the strength and the will to arrest a president of another country. So how they deal with that consequence, I really don't know. We have to wait for what the Deputy President of the Republic, Paul Mashatile, will say with regard to that. Of course, there's been a question raised that South Africa must pull out of the ICC. Yes. There are procedures in the agreement for how you pull out. You can't just wake up in the morning and say, I'm pulling out. No notice of withdrawal and all of that. So it would, if South Africa decided to withdraw now, the processes to withdraw would still be in place by August. South Africa will not have resigned by August. So its decisions on the ICC matter would still be in place. So quite how the matter is going to be handled, I say I really don't want to guess. Let's wait for what the government is going to say.
I mean, everything that we've spoken about now is how countries outside of Africa have directly affecting the continent. And this year's theme is, of course, the acceleration of the African continental free trade area, which would create that single market access. But we still rely on countries like the U.S. And AGOA is up for renewal. Now, we recently had the U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Brigidi, making astonishing claims, to say the least, that South Africa supplied arms to Russia. So we are affected by the geopolitical, tensions between these two countries. Do you believe that there's any credence to those claims? And how do you assess the way in which South Africa has managed what is clearly a diplomatic fallout? And some have argued that the U.S. is trying to push South Africa towards a certain stance.
Yes, no, I saw those reports in the media about U.S. ambassador. My immediate response to myself was that it sounded to me like a very unlikely story. Because indeed, in terms of the rules and regulations and the law in the country, specifically the law prohibits the export of weapons to countries that are in conflict. It's prohibited. So if there had been weapons sent out, that person must be arrested and charged. It would be illegal, I'm saying, in terms of our own law. So I didn't believe the story that was said by the ambassador. But if I had been asked, I would have said there's no such thing that happened. What happened on that boat, I don't know, I wasn't there. But the movement of weapons, I think, is quite unlikely. In any case, South Africa does not produce weapons of the sophistication that the Russians are using. We don't have the capacity
So in other words, we don't even need an inquiry, surely?
Well, I understand that. I'm informed that this matter had been raised earlier by the Americans. And an agreement sort of reached that there would be this kind of commission of inquiry which the President talked about, President Ramaphosa. So that it's a credible, if it's a no, it's a credible no. That if South Africa itself said there was no such weapons, people might not believe it. They say you're just covering up for yourself. But if you do it under a judicial inquiry, presided over by this retired judge, and they say there were no weapons, then everybody would believe them. I think that is why President Ramaphosa is going the route he's taking. Not because they can't say there were no weapons, but to make sure that the population at large, at home and abroad, believes that whatever is said by that inquiry is credible.
We've touched on several issues now that are clearly not just South African problems only, but they're continental. It's been a long time since that very now famous speech of yours on the African Renaissance in 1996. When you look at the dream that you had at the time, vis-a-vis the way in which things are taking place even in your own home country, there's load shedding, high levels of unemployment, do you still think that dream can be realized, and how?
Yes, I'm sure it can. Not only that it can, but it must. It's a part of the task, as I've been saying, is this implementation business. And implementation requires a proper and correct understanding of the situation we face in order to be able to produce correct answers. So, look at the matter of ESCOM. What is the reason for this crisis at ESCOM? A decision is taken, for instance, by government in 2004 that ESCOM must build new power stations. 2004. This is now 2023. That's 19 years later. Why is Kusiland still not been finished? Power station. Why is it taking 19 years and it's not finished? That suggests to me that there was a deliberate effort on the part of some people not to complete the building of Kusiland, to produce a crisis. And that's what I'm saying. You need to understand the issue honestly in order to be able to deal with it. So the progress that we have not made since we talked about that speech you talked about in 1996, yes. Again, we need as Africans to ask ourselves that question, why have we not moved? And answer those questions correctly, honestly, in order to find the right answers. It's not happening sufficiently. So I think there's a need. Look at people like yourselves in the media to insist on those questions. This is what you said. This is what in your policy as Africans. Why are there no results? So that you oblige people who are in positions of authority to have to look at these matters very critically in order to produce the right answers. That's the only way we are going to reach this renaissance of the African continent. Not just to produce wish lists.
Yes. Or talk shops.
Really to have a detailed, what are we going to do to achieve this? In detail, practically.
Before? Do we have a leadership crisis on the continent, if we're talking about being honest?
So, that's part of the problem, definitely. We have not done what we should have done. I suppose in part because my instinct as a political figure is to present myself in a good light.
Yes.
To say I've got a good story to tell.
Sounds familiar.
Which means you don't attend to the problems.
Yes.
So that I get re-elected because I've got a good story to tell. But you have not addressed the problems. So the point you're making about leadership is a very important part of the problem that we're facing.
All right, thank you so much. That's former President Thabo Mbeki there. Well, you heard him do plenty of issues to reflect on. The continent needs to reflect. I mean, the country that we're in, it's unfortunate that we've run out of time, but where we are right now is currently under a transitional government. So there was a military coup in 2021, which speaks exactly to the issues of peace and security on the continent, not just in Guinea or West Africa, but across the board. But you will know that Mr. Mbeki is one person who always remains positive and always really is a fervent ambassador of the continent. And as we've just heard your quote, Dudu, reflecting on that now famous speech on the African Renaissance in 1996.
Ziyanda Ngcobo, thank you very much for that report and conversation with the former President Thabo Mbeki in Guinea-Conakry.